Okay, thank you all for coming out. It's nice to see a good turnout on such a hot day. I figured everybody would be home in the air conditioning. That microphone is not an amp, that's for the video. So I'll try and speak so you can hear me. I'm Ed Spanos. I'm Vice President of the Lovettsville Historical Society. We do this lecture series once a month, February through November. And we try and cover topics from things that are very much local to the Lovettsville, what was known as the German settlement in the old days, up through topics of more general interest, such as this one today. The lectures that we have coming up next month, September 18th, that will be the third Sunday of the month. Usually these are on the second Sunday. But we're going to have Edward Lengel, who has recently published a number of books, but recently published a book which has been in the news called First Entrepreneur. And it's how George Washington built his and the nation's prosperity. It's on George Washington as a businessman and how he applied that to the development of the nation. Ed Lengel, who's the speaker, is at the University of Virginia. He's currently the editor of the George Washington papers. So that promises to be a very interesting talk. In October 9th, we're going to have Doug Perks, who's the chief historian of the Jefferson County Historical Society and of the museum in Charlestown. And his topic will be the one that got away, how Virginia lost Mr. Jefferson's county. And this will be not only on Jefferson County, but on the formation of West Virginia during the Civil War. And in November, we'll get very local. We're going to have John Flannery speaking on the 1940 plane crash, which was at the time the largest. It was a DC-3, I think. I don't know if anybody knows. Somebody's nodding their head. Okay. Airliner which crashed about 2 miles from here in August 1940. At that time, the largest plane crash in U.S. history. So that's been it's a topic of great interest locally here. It was of national interest at the time. And in fact, we still have people here who remember it. So that will be November, and that will probably wind up our series for the year. We have in the back a sign-up sheet. If you haven't been here before, or if you are not on our mailing list and would like to be, please leave your name and email in the back. And if you leave the email legible, there's a good chance you'll actually get on the list. If we can't read it, you won't. So we do that. We also encourage you to take a membership brochure and to become members of the Lovettsville Historical Society. Now, our speaker today, I don't know, where's my information? Here we go. Let me grab it. Unfortunately, because we don't have any 13-year-olds here, we were unable to get the slideshow working, getting the Mac to talk to the Epson printer, projector. So Tim assures me that he can do the talk without it. I'm sure he can. And probably all the illustrations are in his book, or his books back here, a number of them, which he does have for sale. And Beth Rowland in the back there, standing, she will be happy to sell you any of Tim's books which you'd like to have. Tim is a columnist you actually live in Berkeley Springs, I guess. Westford, is that right?
Hagerstown.
Hagerstown, you do live in Hagerstown now, okay. The columnist for the Herald Mail media in Hagerstown, and is an author of a number of books on travel, I guess, the environment, outdoors, and historical events, which include a series of books called the Strange and Obscure Stories. It has the strange and obscure stories of New York City, strange and obscure stories of the Revolutionary War, and strange and obscure stories of the Civil War. And I don't know what your plans are, but maybe the next one will be strange and obscure stories of Lovettsville. depending on what happens today. He is also he's a board member of the C&O Canal Trust. He's active in the Hagerstown Civil War Roundtable and the Warm Springs Watershed Association of Berkeley Springs. He's a humorist, among other things, which we'll probably see some evidence of today. So without further ado, welcome Tim Rowland.
Thank you very much, and thank you for braving the heat. I almost hate to admit this, but when Ed and I were chatting back and forth about a slide presentation, he said, of course, you'll have a slide presentation, and we need to coordinate the equipment and everything like that. And this has been a few days ago. I didn't have a slide presentation, and so I felt like I probably should get a slide presentation. So this weekend I've been frantically putting together a slide presentation that you will not see. But my heart was in the right place. So the upside to that is that for the most part, visuals are not terribly important to this particular talk. Do you have the other paperwork that I have?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I take it with me? Very nice of you.
That's okay. I can probably, if I can do it with that PowerPoint, I can do it out with that notes too. But if there's something that is crucial, I will hold up the laptop and turn it around so you can get the idea of what I'm talking about. A little bit about this project and how it came about. As Ed mentioned, I was writing something on strange and obscure stories of the Revolutionary War. I had started out writing strange, obscure stories of the Civil War until the historians were polite enough to inform me that there were no untold stories of the Civil War. And so I figured I better cut my losses and kind of change the name of change things around a little bit. And the Revolution, believe it or not, was rich in stories that I had not heard, and a lot of people who were fairly up on history had not heard, and a lot of the shrinking minority in the United States that I call normal people had not heard. And so I started. I tried to figure out a reason why that was, and then finally, I finally decided it was because of the way we're taught in public schools. At least it was where I went to school in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, and this would have been around 1970. And we were taught, and that's the first history they teach you, right? So it's, and obviously so, they want you to learn the history of your country. And consequently, that's the first one you get. Maybe when you're about in second or third grade, they try to teach you this history class in between learning your ciphers and your vowels and all that. But because they're teaching it to you in third grade, it's in a very, they run it all through a sieve, and it's a very thin mix. And so you get a lot of cartoon Minutemen firing at each other. You get the storyline that basically goes something like this. It goes, okay, the Revolutionary War in America basically consists of Lexington and Concord, Washington crosses the Delaware, Valley Forge, Yorktown, we win. Which would be fine if they came back at some later date and told us more detail about how the Revolutionary War played out. But that never really happens because they have their other mandates that they have to teach us, other histories that they have to teach us. And so we're left with a pretty thin understanding of what the Civil War or the Revolutionary War really encompasses. I remember when I was, again, like 10 years old, and I was listening to, they tell us the standard lines we had to memorize, and someone asked what was the cause of the Civil War. And we had a very smart student, as far as memorization was concerned, named Donna, and very nice person. And I remember her standing up and just as straight as an arrow and just proudly could be, she said, no taxation without representation. And I remember, even at that age, I thought, you know, she doesn't have the faintest idea what she's talking about. And I've come to learn if she'd cut it off after no taxation, that probably would have been a more accurate picture of why we fought for our independence. But we didn't have a good idea, and even if we had gone into more detail at that particular time or come back and revisited it, the deck was still stacked against us because our history, our own history, has been really tortured and manipulated to the point where, unlike, for example, maybe the Crimean War or something that happened overseas, something that we don't have this personal, it's not our story. Those are told a lot more fairly, I think, than the stories of the Revolutionary War. We know that the storyline usually starts with the Boston Massacre. And one of the images that I was going to show you, and you might get an idea of this, Paul Revere. This was Paul Revere's etching of the Boston Massacre. And of course you have a line of redcoats, and then you have all these poor falling people, poor falling civilians on the other side. You can't see it, but the classic touch is right down at the bottom. There's this little puppy. And so here are the British firing not just on unarmed civilians, but also on little pets. And so it's pretty clear to see where Paul Revere is headed with his narrative. He was, of course, eventually involved in the greatest naval disaster that the United States was to suffer up until Pearl Harbor. He was in charge of artillery up in Maine, an expedition that went terribly wrong. They got trapped up a river and wound up losing all the boats, and they had to walk home. A lot of this fell on Paul Revere. And so Paul Revere staged his own court-martial and very carefully scripted the proceedings so history would remember him as a good guy, not as a bad guy. His etchings, he was very careful with how he was portrayed, with the story that he was putting out. And you find this all throughout New England. And we just had a little discussion up here about you don't get a lot of idea of what was going on in the mid-Atlantic during the Revolution. And there's a very good reason for that. And that is New England controlled the storyline. They kind of represented the Bernie Sanders wing of the Revolution up there. Yeah, they had their lofty ideas. They were tech savvy. They were marketing wizards. You know, we have our tweets today. They had their printing press and their etchings. So they were the ones that basically told the story. I don't think too many people know most of the battles in the Civil War were not fought in Massachusetts. They were fought in South Carolina. But South Carolina did not have quite as much on the ball as far as PR was concerned. Another good example of public relations was Ethan Allen and his competition with Benedict Arnold. And this happened at Fort Ticonderoga. They both decided independently that Ticonderoga would be a great place to conquer. One of the reasons it was a great place to conquer, there were only like 20 people staged there, so it wasn't a real big effort. They got there in the middle of the night, and they're jostling each other to see who is going to get to be the one to demand the surrender of Fort Ticonderoga. Ethan Allen stands up and allegedly, according to Ethan Allen, says, "Captain Delaplace, I demand surrender of this fort in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." What he really said was, "Get out of there, you goddamn old rat." But that didn't sound too good for the letters that he was writing back to the Continental Congress and burnishing his image as the hero of Ticonderoga. While his men were off drinking the rum of the fort, he was up there writing letters to everyone in position of power, telling the story, telling the narrative. Benedict Arnold, meanwhile, before the unpleasantness, was out there capturing other British ships and basically taking control of the entire Lake Champlain region that really gave America, early America, a good head start in the Revolution itself. So you have the show ponies and the work ponies, and the show ponies tended to be New England centric, so we really didn't hear a lot about what was going on in other parts of the country. We know those heroes. We know the Paul Reveres, the Ethan Allens, the Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington, Robert Morris. Robert Morris is important to this story because he was known as the financier of the Revolution, but he was also a great land speculator. And he was not the type that would have been involved a whole lot in this particular area where we are now. It was beneath him. But he would not have been above buying up all the land that he could get his hands on in order to sell it at a bigger price later on. He thought that people would be pretty eager, the Europeans would be pretty eager to come over and buy American soil. He was right. He was about 120 years too early, but he was right. And he wound up getting further and further behind. He owned 6 million acres of the frontier. A lot of these were what the map makers called howling wilderness up in New York or pine barrens down in Georgia, but he still had a tremendous amount of property. He and a fellow by the name of James Greenleaf owned about half of Washington, D.C. when they began selling lots. And he thought this was going to make him spectacularly rich. It did not play out well for him. What he wound up doing was all these deeds, stop me if this sounds familiar, all these toxic assets he started lumping together into an early version of credit default swaps, and he packaged them together and into something that looked like it had a good AAA credit rating. It was the North Atlantic Holding Company. It was actually the first REIT, a real estate investment trust in America. And then he sold shares of it. And people willingly bought this company, not realizing that it was full of worthless property. Then he took that money and bought even more worthless property. So his interest in the Revolution typifies what a lot of the New England, what a lot of the elite people in the Revolution felt was important. And that was a way to come to fabulous wealth through either being a merchant, a land speculator, or some sort of big picture, big commerce idea for the lands across the Appalachian Mountains. The other group that we have not talked about yet are the ones that I like to call the founding fathers from the dark side. And they are the ones that were here. And they came along about a decade to 2 decades earlier than these people in the who are up in New England. And they were people with names like Thomas Cressup, Christopher Gist, Meshach Browning, George Croghan, and James McCullough. These were the people who were here along the frontier when the Indians began to attack as part of the French and Indian War. And they are why it's crucial to understand the French and Indian War in order to understand the forces that put the Revolution in play. You know, while researching the French and Indian War and the Revolution, I was kind of disappointed that there were no great stories really that came out of our particular region. Now there were, if you fast forward to the Revolution, 3 probably of the worst Revolutionary War generals wound up in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And so Charles Lee and Horatio Gates and Adam Stevens would actually sit around getting drunk at night at Stevens' place and talking about how badly they screwed up in the Revolution. But it was, by that time, it was kind of a joke to them. But then the more I looked at put the emphasis on the French and Indian War, you start to see that the incubator of the Revolution was not Lexington and Concord. It was not the Greens of Boston. It happened right here. And that's the story that you're going to hear today of why we basically were the ones that made the Revolution inevitable. It's a story that encompasses the Cumberland and Shenandoah valleys, more or less starting from Chambersburg, coming down through the Shenandoah Valley about a little past Winchester, I would say. This, where we're standing, would be kind of the place where people would run for refuge when the Indians attacked. And the reason for their attacks were pretty much the same ones that this is where the schools did get it right. We were taking their lands, and so they were trying to get them back. But you have this contrast. You have the Highrollers, you have people like Thomas Lee, who of course was the member of the famous Lee family, and he started the Ohio Company in 1848, and this was to speculate on lands over the mountains. On the other side of that equation, you would have people like Meshach Browning, who's not a contemporary, he came on a little bit later, but he was a hunter, and he, instead of just talking about what was beyond the mountains, he actually went beyond the mountains. He wrote a rather curious book that historians tend to discount because in his lifetime he said that he had killed 500 bear and 2,000 deer. Some think that's excessive, although if he had lived where we live, the 2,000 deer seems kind of plausible. So we boil this down to essentially the old argument that has persisted to this day, the 1% versus the 99%. And you had the 1%, you had the Robert Morris, you had the Thomas Lees, the ones that wanted that wealth for the sake of wealth was what drove them. Now certainly there are ideological arguments along the way, but commerce probably played a bigger role in their thinking than did the rights of man and all that. And then you had the other 99%. And they were of so little influence that when the Indians came attacking them up and down the valley here, they could scarcely get any redress from the colonial governments that were in Virginia or in Maryland or in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, of course, didn't like to fight in the first place, so that was a doubly tough sell. And there were, looking at the groundwork, there were 4 French and Indian Wars, and they go back to 1688. And they start out being, they came after what were called the Beaver Wars, and this was, fur pelts were what everyone was after. That was going to be the big money maker for them. And a pattern erupted then. And the pattern was that the colonists, now this is mostly up a little further than the north, and this would be through the early part of the 1700s, the colonists would do the fighting and they would not get any reward for it. A classic case was the capture of, in Nova Scotia, the fort of Louisbourg. And Massachusetts lost about 8% of its male population, the colonists that were killed or wounded in that particular stretch. But they did captured the French fort of Louisbourg. Then, about 2 years later, the English gave it back to the French in exchange for some little province over in India. Well, of course, you can imagine the reaction that the colonists had to this. Their blood, sweat, and tears had gone into capturing this, and then the British don't even care enough for them that they would hold on to it and give them the spoils of that particular victory. And this is, as the greater French and Indian War that we're familiar with breaks out, this becomes the pattern. And the pattern is that Britain was at war with France, but the Americans were at war with the Indians. Now, a lot of you have probably talked to people who about the French and Indian War, and when I was a kid, I thought the French were fighting the Indians. I didn't see why they didn't tell us the rest of the story in the title. But of course, the standard line is, okay, you've got the French and the Indians and the British, and someone will ask you, but which side are the Americans on? And of course, since I'm not that bright to begin with, anytime I get a softball like that, I'm self-important, and I can say, well, of course, we were all British at that time. There were no real Americans out there fighting independently. Except there kind of were. Especially by the end of the French and Indian War, you can see this fracture, that all of a sudden the British and the Americans become two different people. The French and Indian War that we have come to know and love was basically started in 1754. It should have been an easy one for the British because the British colonists numbered about 2 million and the French colonists numbered about 60,000. Now, of course, the French colonists had a lot of help, and that would have been in the form of the Indians, who were disposed to like the French because the French would give them gifts. The French would treat them, even dating back to Champlain in 1600, would treat them with civility. The English treated them like slaves or dogs, they said, and so they were disposed to fight with the French. The Indians also, throughout our history, have a fairly dismal track record of siding with the losers in pretty much any battle you can think of through here. It's just through bad luck, they're seldom on the winning side. And who were these 2 million that the British had? The British colonists. At this point in time, as coincidence would have it, this particular area, a little bit more to the west, up through Hagerstown, Clear Spring, Chambersburg, what was called the Conachajig on the north side and the Apecan on the south side of the Potomac Rivers. These communities were being filled by Scotch Irish, and they were coming over in tremendous quantities. And probably about 200,000, about 200,000 of them in the mid-1700s alone. And they had been given lands in Ireland, and immediately the rents were raised, and they were given all kinds of economic disincentives, and so they didn't like the crown to begin with, and so they saw this as an escape. And here there is plenty of free land, or relatively free. They ran all kinds of schemes to get even more land. Here in this particular area, they would petition the governor for more property, and to make it sound like they were eligible for more than they could actually have, they would give their cows human names. They would have women dress up like men and go try to get their stake. And at some point, a lot of the people it was sort of a similar situation to what we see today with immigration. The people who are already here, a lot of the Quakers, some of the Catholics said, wait a minute, how are all these people allowed to come in here? But they were certainly industrious. They took the ball and ran with it, and they became the backbone of the settlements of the frontier along what is known today as the Allegheny Front, the beginning of the Appalachian Mountains. One person to introduce you to, and we know what he thought because he kept a diary, and oddly enough, that diary has persevered, and it just came out in book form, printed by the Conachajig Institute, and it was the diary of James McCullough. And he did not start out, like most Scotch Irish, he did not start out looking for trouble. He located eventually in the Conachajig Valley, just a little bit north of Clear Spring, south of Mercersburg, and he had an operation where he produced flax and made that into cloth. He was also for frontier times, rather sophisticated. He did the banking for a lot of people, and the fact that he was keeping a diary at all kind of put him a little bit above the common clay. He was not anything like the founding fathers you would have found up in New England, but he did have, he was one of the people who were critically involved and critically interested in what would happen in these western lands. About the first action of the French and Indian War, 1755, was a general by the name of Edward Braddock, who crossed over through Washington County, Maryland, got to Cumberland, and really seemed to be more interested in cutting a road up to Pittsburgh, where the French had built Fort Duquesne, than he wasn't actually attacking. He took his time. He thought that this was going to become a trade artery because he thought this victory over the French and the Indians was going to be a piece of cake. It was not. He took his men, he had more men, but he still got routed by the French and Indians up in the general area of Pittsburgh. John McCullough reports in his diary seeing the stragglers from this debacle come limping back almost through his backyard and going back toward Philadelphia. And having been victim of Indian attacks themselves, what must the people in that community have thought? They said, here are our great protectors. They went out to clear the area for us, and instead of making a safe zone, they come back dragging along, and worse than that, they don't even stop to regroup. They spend the night at a tavern very close to McCullough's farm, and then in the morning, instead of turning around and going back to get the revenge, they just head on back to Philadelphia and essentially are never seen again. So that's the first taste of the French and Indian War that James McCullough and a lot of the settlers in this particular region would have seen. Braddock himself was certainly floored by the fact that he lost. He, again, being British, felt that there wasn't a whole lot of difference between Indians and dogs. And so the thought that he could go out and lose to a bunch of mindless savages was just beyond anything that he could have reasoned with. His last words on his deathbed were, he had been mortally wounded, and his last words were, "Whoever would have thought?" And that's how stunned he was that he had been defeated. But for the French and the Indians, it was a pretty good couple of years. And a lot of this went their way, and that was bad news for James McCullough and the rest of the people on the frontier of the Apachen communities and the Conococheague communities. Some notations from the diary, and I have a couple slides of the diary that can give you a quick idea of what we're dealing with. It's a lot of times it's kind of hard to translate, but he does have a pretty extensive report on the killings. Just take May of 1757, for example. John Martin and Andrew Pant taken captive by the Indians from Conococheague. May the 13th, 2 men killed near McCormick's on the Kanawha. He finally moved into the cabin of somebody else for protection. On May the 19th, he reports on May 15th that 11 persons were killed at Paxton by the Indians. On June 6th, 2 men were killed, 5 men were taken captive near what is now Shippensburg. So this is what the promise of America had become to a lot of the settlers up and down these valleys. You might have weeks, months of relative peace, and then you'd be out in the field reaping, sowing, and you'd look up, and over the next ridge you could see smoke coming up. And you know that your neighbor's cabin had been burned and that your neighbors were dead, and you would know that they were coming for you next. And it could happen at any time without any particular warning. McCullough's own children were kidnapped by the Indians when they were out working in the field. He made a couple trips to try to recapture them. On one time, and this is kind of a commentary on what life was like on the frontier, he found his oldest son and began to bring him back. The oldest son escaped and ran back to the Indians because life among the Indians presumably was easier than life working on the frontier for one of these farmers. But he did get one back. He never saw the other one again. The British, for their part, did not feel too much anguish over this because they felt all along that they'd be giving us, the national defense of the colonists was essentially being given to the colonists for free. And so without any kind of money for the effort, the British were not terribly disposed to go all out as they might. But again, the British were less concerned about the Indians and more concerned about the French. And that's where they started to make their play. It took them a while to get their sea legs. They brought over someone whose name is well familiar to all of us, Lord Loudon, and he was the governor. To be the governor of Virginia, he was going to be the commander. He was taken over for Braddock. He was going to coordinate everything. See if I have. The one historian wrote about him, he demonstrated his professionalism by marching undauntedly from one defeat to another. And he was a pretty good administrator in his defense. He was good at coordinating supplies and things like that. Would have been a good quartermaster, but as far as fighting, as far as anything else, he just was pretty terrible, is the consensus of historians. He did not see the area. He did not see Loudoun County that gave him his name. And he was basically, when he arrived, he had 17 servants, 2 mistresses, a full set of dishes, cabinets, and a chariot. And eventually this became a cause célèbre for the 99%, the people in this valley in the French Revolution, or in the French and Indian War. 10, 20 years later, they remembered Lord Loudon when it came time to fight the British, and they brought up his name, and they were so disappointed with his results that they used his name. His abuses became a rallying cry for a full-fledged revolt during the Revolution. That was how much he was despised. So the British at least did get rid of Loudon after 2 years in 1758, and they did something else that they hoped would help. The big problem with all the people lined up along the frontier, of course, was the Indian attack. So the British decided they would sign a treaty, the Treaty of Easton, and say, okay, we're not going to put any more forts in your area, you don't attack our people. And this had a relatively minimal result. The good part about the Scotch Irish were that they were industrious. They came in, they settled, they civilized, they had their churches, they had their social structure, but they were not above playing fast and loose with the rules that governed land acquisition. For example, the Indians might sell them all the land in between Philadelphia and the amount of ground that a man could walk in a day. Well, to the Indians, they felt that might be like 20 miles. But what the settlers would do is they would basically stake out like a relay race. And so the first guy would leave the blocks from Philadelphia. He would sprint as far as he could for about a couple of miles. Then the next guy would sprint as far as he could for a couple of miles. And so by doing this, that 20 miles that the Indians thought they were giving up turned out to be like 120. So there's a lot of land gains by hook and by crook that were not terribly on the level. And through these processes, they had slowly been pushing the Indians to the west. The Indians finally said enough when they reached, in Pennsylvania, it would be Tuscarora Mountain. And that's more or less where they made their stand. The Scotch Irish still tried to push over the top of the mountain, and this is what caused such brutal attacks from the Indians. The British hoped this Treaty of Easton would settle things down a little bit, which it seemed to for a while. They also knew that they could defeat, because of their numbers and their logistics, they could defeat the French pretty handily without the Indians in play. And that turned out to be true. And the French and Indian War essentially, for all intents and purposes, ended about 1860, and you know how these things go. The treaties weren't formalized and everything until about 3 years later. But the French and Indian War made the revolution inevitable in about 4 very specific ways. The first was that the French had not just been beaten, they had been humiliated. They had to give up everything, all their holdings in North America. They had to give up, of course, the broader name of this conflict is the 7 Years' War, so they were fighting all over the planet. And they had to give up just about everything they held dear. And the British accepted no quarter. They demanded every single thing they could get. And so by the time the Revolution came around, 15 years, 20 years later, the French were still seething about the treatment they had gotten at the hands of the British when they were signing these peace deals. And as a matter of fact, the king, when being lobbied to enter the revolution on the side of the Americans, the argument that really put him over the top was, remember how the British treated us in the French and Indian War, and don't you think we ought to get a little bit of revenge for that? And the king said, yeah. And that's what pushed the French to side with America. Second problem that was a little bit more immediate was the war is very costly for Britain. It doubled the size of its national debt, and it had no way, it was pretty much, of course the war had been going on around the world, it had no way of making up those funds back at home, and this is where we start to see that series of taxes, you know, on stamps, on various other products, on tea, on the colonists. Their logic, and it seems pretty logical to us at this time, was that you know, we cleaned out the hornet's nest. Now you got to give us a little something for the effort. The Americans, of course, did not want to do this, and it became a rallying cry for the revolution. It became a rallying cry even when taxes weren't really in play, such as the Boston Tea Party, which was more symbolism than substance, but again, really helped the Americans and made their decision more clear. Third thing, the French had a choice, or the English really had a choice since they were dictating terms, and that was, do you want to keep, as the French is giving all its land back to Britain, it was, do you want to keep Canada or do you want to keep Guadeloupe? And there's a tremendous debate about this over in Britain. Everybody is arguing, do we want Canada or do we want Guadeloupe? Voltaire said, take Guadeloupe, it's got sugar, it's got great sugar production. Up in Canada, you just, you know, all you're getting is a few acres of snow. The Canadian argument was that, well, there is the beaver trade up there, but still compared to sugar, it was relatively non-productive. The British wound up taking Canada, however, because they felt it would be an easier way to keep an eye on the colonists, to make sure that the colonists didn't get up to any funny business. And that sounded good on the surface, but what really happened was that an important check and balance had been taken away from the equation in North America, because the colonists were never going to attack Britain with the French up here in Canada hanging over their head and just waiting for colonists and British to fight each other, to beat each other to a pulp, at which point they would sweep in and capture the entire continent. And so the French were very important as a break on colonial aggression. But when the British got rid of the Canadians, all of a sudden that break was removed. The fourth thing in 1863 was something that's called Pontiacs War. And again, the British had not, they had their Treaty of Easton, and they were going to, they're going to be nice. They were going to stop building over in the Indian Territory, and in exchange, the Indians weren't going to kill anybody. It took about 30 seconds for the British to realize, or for the Indians to realize that the British were not intent on honoring any of this. They started enlarging forts. They started breaking the treaty in all manner of ways. And pretty soon Pontiac, and this is a little sketchy on the history, but for sake of argument, a great Indian leader named Pontiac riled up the Indians, and they came sweeping down from the north and from the Ohio territories and laid tremendous siege, particularly to the people of this particular area. Just across the line in Pennsylvania, there's the Enoch Brown School is famous for being attacked by Indians. 10 children were scalped. The schoolmaster was scalped. On their way back, they found a pregnant woman and cut the fetus out from her. They went, they were young braves, and they went marching back into their camp. And the elders all but kicked them out and said, "We don't fight this way. We don't fight against children." But that mindset was there. The hatred was there. They were going to do anything they could to attack the people that lived in our communities that we lived in today. So the British decided to make this even stronger, and they decided to put teeth into this treaty. And they had, if anyone asks you what caused the American Revolution, you can just knowingly say the Proclamation line of 1683 and make them prove you wrong. Or 17, because that, or 1763, I've got 2 out of 4 numbers wrong. So because that was the line, that was what really set the stage and joins up the French and Indian War with the American Revolution. In 1763, the king drew this hard and fast line that basically went down the Eastern Continental Divide, right down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, and said, "Here it is. We're not going to go west of this. You don't go east of this." So this time there could be no room for a misunderstanding. It was laid out in stone, and it was, as Donald Trump would say, it was a disaster for the British. Because what had happened here, and if you think back to the participants, you had the 1% who were the people in New England with the lofty ideas, the Robert Morrises with the land speculation, the Thomas Lees with the Ohio Company. You had traders, you had all sorts of folk who were bound and determined to make great wealth on everything that was on the other side of this line. Then you had the settlers who had been killed. They'd watched their family, their friends get slaughtered. They had stuck it out. They had gritted it out. They had a vision that one day, if they just stuck it out, they would be able to go to the west and locate an even more desirous land on the other side of this proclamation line. And for the first time in colonial history, you see the interests of the 1% converging with the interests of the 99%. Before that, they really had no use for each other. But now they did. Now they're on the same page. And now, all of a sudden, up in New England, they could count on these Scotch Irish in particular of coming and supplying the manpower that they never would have gotten without this development. And so probably I think about 4 of the first 5 regiments that went up to lay siege to Boston were Scotch Irish from right through this area. These were the preachers, the Presbyterian preachers who had, they'd preach, they'd have their pulpit, and their long gun would be lying up against the pulpit. They're just spoiling for a fight, and this gave them the fight. They also had this ancestral history with the British, so they were very eager to settle that score as well. One quick story of what came just before the Revolution was the story of the Black Boys' Rebellion, and this happened not far from here, just across the Pennsylvania line, and it tends to show how British authority was breaking down, because now the numbers lined up, now you needed some cracks in the British authority, and this would be it. A trader by the name of George Croghan, and he's another one of these founding fathers from the dark side, was going in and selling goods to the Indians. He was doing 2 things. He was stocking the forts that were along the Fort Pitt, the British forts, but he was also taking along a little something for the Indians. Most of what he was taking on for the Indians, allegedly, was rum and gunpowder. So what could go wrong? There were even something on the manifest that were listed as scalping knives. Now, if you are a settler in the Conococheague or in the Appalachians, and you see this pack train going through and they're going to serve the Indians, and you happen to have pretty good information that it's full of scalping knives, it's full of gunpowder, it's full of rum, and it's to be sold to the Indians who have just been in your backyard scalping you, cutting out fetuses, killing your babies, what would they have thought? What would James McCullough have thought about that? Well, it boiled over pretty fast, and there was a group of up to about 300 men who called themselves the Black Boys because they had painted their faces black. And they may have taken some liberties and gone too far, it's true, as they said in Animal House. But their first action was to go and confiscate this wagon train, and they confiscated supposedly gunpowder, rum. They took some blankets for themselves. It's always been a bit sketchy as to exactly what the contents of these wagon trains consisted of, but certainly the settlers felt there was enough incendiary stuff that they had to keep them out of Indian hands. There happened to be a fort, a British fort, in very close proximity to this, to where this wagon train was detained and destroyed. The British came out not on the side of the settlers. The British came out on the side of the traders who were effectively breaking the law by giving these contraband supplies to the Indians. And so for the settlers, that was strike number 2. First of all, it's happening. Second of all, we point out that it's happening, and what do? They side with the guys that are clearly in the wrong. And so the Black Boys surrounded the fort. They'd had a couple they'd had a couple dust-ups before. Some of their men had been captured and taken into the fort. More importantly, some of their guns had been captured and taken into the fort. And so they surround this fort of British regulars, complete with their redcoats, and they fire on this fort. And at different times, they catch them out of the stockade, and they get into gunfire. I don't know if it was the guns or the marksmanship, but nobody ever seemed to get hurt in these shootouts. One colonist did get hit in the thigh, and that was about it. But the point was, here they are exchanging fire with British regulars. And as near as I can determine, that's the first time that colonists have really assaulted regular British soldiers. They had certainly assaulted colonists who were fighting for the British, but these were Scottish Highlanders, specifically professional soldiers. And so this certainly upped the ante quite a bit. The Black Boys effectively won. They drove out the garrison at Fort Loudon, and they went up to Fort Bedford. And everybody at that point said, this maybe has probably gone far enough. and everything settled back down after that. And there's a lot of scholarly debate as to what the meaning of this was. There was a movie, a John Wayne movie, that was made, that was called like the Allegheny Uprising or something like that basically said these were heroes. They had struck the first blow for American independence. You know, you're thinking, great, that happened right in our backyard. That's probably overstating it. They probably didn't have any idea of separating into a new nation at that time. This life, liberty, pursuit of happiness was not high on their agenda. They just wanted to be left alone more than anything. But the thinking today is that, well, it wasn't even a rebellion, really. It was just kind of this little kerfuffle, and it doesn't have any historic significance to it at all. I would tend to disagree. I think, you know, an embryo doesn't turn into an adult moth overnight. There are stages it has to go through. And what the settlers saw with this, it might not have moved the needle as far as events go, but what the settlers saw was that we can take on the British. They're not sacred anymore. If they are doing something with which we are displeased, we have the option of taking actual guns and shooting at them. And I don't think you can understate that, and I don't think the people back then would have understated it as well. This was, of course, in any historical event, there's always what constituted the first shots of the war or the revolution. Of course, here you have the shot heard around the world. You have the Boston Massacre. This wasn't the shot that did it, or shots, but it certainly was, as the phrase goes today, a game changer. And certainly everyone would have known what happened. You could see how fast Indian attacks, word of Indian attacks, raced up and down the valleys, even in those days before rapid flow of information. So these people talked, and they were very good at disseminating what was happening. And they would have known. And this was a very serious chink in the British armor. And I think that gave confidence to the people in New England who knew, one, it can be done, and two, all of a sudden we've got a whole lot of people down there who are going to be at our side if we decide to go this route. There is one last quote I'll leave you with, because these are still a lot of them are the Scotch Irish. You know, Daniel Morgan from Winchester was probably one of the more famous ones. He was a far better general, really, than the George Washington when it came to tactics. He was one of these people who was just the right place at the right time in historical terms. And he would have been kind of the bread and butter, the salt of the earth of the people who lived through these valleys that rose up probably by the tens of thousands and formed the regiments that went in and fought the British. And again, this went back centuries. One historian wrote, "The resentment which they carried with them continued to burn in their new homes in America, and in the War of Independence, England had no fiercer enemies than the grandsons and great-grandsons of the Presbyterians who had held Ulster against Tyrconnell." And one last quote I'll leave you with, which kind of sums it up. Horace Walpole, who was writing about the way the situation turned out and how the Scotch Irish, the 99% down here, were able to team up with the 1% sipping tea up in their cafes up in Boston. And he said simply, "There is no use crying about it. Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, and that is the end of it." And maybe with some degree of pride, we can say that those Presbyterians, a lot of them were littered right along these the old wagon roads that cross this very area. So So thank you, and any questions you might have, I'd be happy to
Okay, we will take questions in a minute. First, for those of you who are new, you will notice that we don't charge admission costs of these lectures. We want to keep them free because we want to encourage people to come. We do pass the hat, and we're going to do that now, so we do also encourage you to be generous in that respect as it comes around. And again, if you, just to repeat, if we don't have your email and you'd like to be on our email list, please leave your name in the back. The first question came in by email. I bet you didn't know we did that. But Bill George, sitting back there, sent me a question a few days ago, which I will attempt to answer first, and then Tim can comment too. But what was did we know of any participation from this area in the French-Indian War? So I did a little bit of looking into that. This immediate area here, as people know, was known as the German settlement, and was settled beginning in the 1730s by Germans who came from Maryland and Pennsylvania. During the French-Indian War, this area was sometimes categorized as the inner frontier as opposed to the outer frontier, which is the Shenandoah Valley. The two major counties being at that point Frederick County and Augusta County, which were, Frederick County covered a much larger area, probably down around Harrisonburg or so, than it does now. As Tim said, the frontier was settled by Scotch Irish, but also by Germans, both of whom tended to come from Pennsylvania. In terms of fighting propensities, one scholar or historian who looked at this said that the Scotch Irish, who were predominant in Augusta County in the valley, were much fiercer fighters in this war than were the Germans, who predominated in Frederick County, Winchester. And there were a lot of pacifists and other Dunkards and other elements among the Germans also, which affected this. Now, here, I'll come back to that in a minute. Here, we were part of Fairfax County at the beginning of the war. There was a militia system that existed in 1753, which was very ineffective. And in fact, I think it was William Fairfax was the captain of one of the militia groups in Fairfax. But they had a very difficult time holding people in there. So in 1755, I guess, maybe somebody knows, or beginning of 1754, governor decided to form a Dinwiddie, to form a sort of more of a regular army, and formed what was called the Virginia Regiment. And that was subject to military discipline, to the laws of war and so forth. Aimed at 1,200, actually I think ended up in the first one is with about 700. And somebody did a study of this thing to see the origins of where they were located. They were either conscripted, or some of them were, it was the kind of system where if you were conscripted, you could buy your way out, and someone else could get paid or bounty to go in. But the Germans participated very, very little. In fact, in Fairfax County, which we were part of till 1757, there was what's the figure? Something like 123 men in that. Only one was of German origin. So I think it's safe to conclude that they had little or no participation in this area here. Winchester was a little different because, and here I have to disagree with something you said, Tim. I don't think it was as simple as saying that the American settlers, just went and stole the Indian land and the French were nice to the Indians. It's a lot more complicated than that. And many of the American colonists, particularly Pennsylvania, had very good relations with the Indians. And in fact, in the Shenandoah Valley, from the histories I've read, the German settlers lived in peace with the Indians up until, for 21 years, 23 years or so, I get from 2031 when they came in, up until the outbreak of the war. But you had, at that point, when the conflict broke out, then the French were inciting the Indians and sending them back, saying they're coming to steal your land, they're coming to steal your land, which in some cases was true, but it was not always true. And there were a number of the Indian tribes, including the Iroquois Confederation, were allies of the British Americans, right, at the outbreak of the war. Braddock's treatment, saying we don't need these savages, what can they do, alienated a lot of the tribes that would have fought with us there, and they went over to the French. I mean, that was one of a series of blunders which went on throughout the Revolutionary War too. But point I was making that it was a somewhat differentiated picture, and of the Germans who were here, who were not directly affected by the war. The Germans in the Shenandoah Valley were. When they were attacked, then they fought back, and they fought back very well. And the Indians at that point, after over 2 decades of peace, were coming back east into that area and attacking families and doing all the things you said. And then they fought. But the participation was much higher among Scotch Irish than among the Germans. In contrast to the Revolutionary War, where the Germans in the valley, as people know this, probably the story of General Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran pastor in the German community out there, who formed the Virginia Regiment, the German regiment, in the Revolutionary War. And the Germans fought very well and very well organized in that war, but I think that had to do a lot with the fact that there was no love lost between the German settlers here and the English on the seaboard, because they were basically sent to the valley as a buffer or as cannon fodder, is why they were encouraged to settle there. So there was a big difference between the Revolutionary War and the French-Indian War as to how, particularly the Germans, their participation in it. And to go back to Bill's question, it looks as if there was little, if any, participation from this immediate area in the French-Indian War. So that's my question and answer. We can take other questions now to Tim. But if you want to say something on that.
No, I think one thing that kind of proves your point is that when perhaps you find it odd that if you go up to present-day Pittsburgh and all these places in western Pennsylvania, and normally you would think, well, this is it would be the Pennsylvanians that would be out there trying to expand except it always wound up being Virginians that were coming up there. And if you look at it's a fascinating list of the people who went with Braddock on that initial trip. I think Daniel Morgan was along. I think Croghan was along. Probably about 5 or 6 other names that you recognize that I can't recall off the top of my head. But it was quite a who's who of people that wanted to go out there and either make a name for themselves or get some land for themselves. And I think that's, if you look at the Ohio Company, you had a lot of these traders that wore so many different hats, and it was not so much a people, a community. It was somebody here who was interested in land speculation. It was somebody here that was interested in trade. And it was a more selective, it's hard to say that a group was swept up and went in. And a lot of them would wind up with, Croghan had something like 250,000 acres of Pennsylvania that he owned. And he was up there protecting his interests, and he went, and all these Virginians that were in the Ohio Company were interested in creating wealth. And so that's, at that point, I would say it wasn't so much patriotic, I don't think. It was, most people seem to have, or nationalistic. It was, that would change. But early on, I believe that people had an economic interest primarily at heart.
Anybody want to question that?
When Braddock was defeated, how long would it take word of that defeat to reach Williamsburg?
Oh boy, I'm not sure about Williamsburg, but I believe it was always faster than you would think, and I think it got back to the settlements in the Conococheague by about 3 days. Is that right? Yeah, and when they retreated by way of Winchester. They came down to Winchester and then got on the wagon road and went north. And so it was probably, if you extrapolate, something like a week maybe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you might want to mention Jim Webb's book, Born Fighting, because he gets into a lot of the history of the Scotch Irish and also a lot about their participation in the Revolutionary War. I mean, that would be a book people might want to look at to get more information on the Scotch Irish and their participation in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, it really was astounding. They were as a matter of fact, one of my slides had a picture of a Scotch Irish and the caption was "Born Fighting," and so that kind of tells you all you need to know. There were, of course, a lot of the Germans were, or the Germanics were, Mennonites or Amish or Dunkers or people who are just the opposite, who are not disposed to fighting at all.
Well, first I have to disclose I'm from New England.
Okay.
And also of Scottish origin. So, first I have a question. I mean, I could have a whole debate, but what year was that Black Boys Rebellion?
1765. And it started in 1765, bled over into 1766, and as late as 1769, there were elements of it. There was, but it got to be kind of a, almost like a grievance process. It's kind of like, we're mad, so we're going to blacken our faces and go raise hell. And
anyway, I absolutely agree with you on the 1763 line. I think that, however, a lot earlier than that, there was a concept which, yes, was enunciated by the people who wrote the newspapers, right? Which were not just in New England, also Philadelphia, also Princeton, another Scottish center, which supplied a lot of those so-called intellectuals in the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson, others of those sort. So I think that your presentation tends to make it a bit more bifurcated than it actually was, even though we were a literate society relative to Europe, not only in big cities, but also on the frontier. Certainly in Pennsylvania, that was the case. And it was, yes, the southern, further south you got, probably the less. That was actually the case. But you had an idea that was permeating the entire country, I believe, from the time of the 17th century, that included a continental perspective. And of course, everyone had their then that fits into people's individual interests of wanting to expand, wanting to invest, wanting to make money. But keep in mind, with someone like Robert Morris, whom I thought you had mentioned, virtually died in debtor's prison, that these people were threatened with hanging. I mean, they were revolting against the powers that be that were right there. On the frontier, the British were not right there for the, so to speak. In those cities, the British come and conquer your city, you've had it. So yes, you wanted to make civilization, money, a future for generations to come and so forth. But you were putting your life in your hands for effectively an idea.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because James McCullough was never going to stand up and say that he regretted having only one life to get to his country. He wasn't there yet. But the people in the city, and you find all these different. We run into this problem when we say that the founding fathers wanted or the founding fathers thought. And there are just so many different ways and patterns. And, you talk about the Indians and the colony and what the land negotiations going back and forth and how that played out. But then you had Iroquois that were coming down and selling lands that were actually owned by the Delaware. And so it's so hard to really understand. But you're absolutely right. It was a lot more complex than that.
To take it back to the French and Indian War, I had the privilege accidentally of sitting with Stephen Reysan Stephen's from Winchester, and he was telling me about the work that's being done in Winchester to save a French and Indian War property called Fort Loudon. So please don't leave today without saying hi to Stephen.
And we also have a number of members and former members on the board of directors. And if you want to know more about the French and Indian War in Frederick County, and especially Fort Loudon, the Fort Loudon that George Washington planned and built and acted as his headquarters during the French and Indian War, you can visit our website, FIFW, French and Indian War Foundation.org.
And don't hold Lord Loudon against him, because he was only trying to help.
And our Fort Loudon in Winchester should not be confused with the other Fort Loudon
Fort Loudon,
talking
yeah.
about in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, right.
Or the one in Tennessee.
Yeah. The Loudon got around.
Didn't he die?
No, he went back and had kind of, I think he had kind of a golden parachute where he did quite well back over in Britain.
Oh, it's Lord Loudon himself.
Yes.
I'm also with the Christian